Welcome to our next segment in the Daughters of Liberty series. Today we're going to examine what might have been in a colonial woman's sewing basket. This is one example of a sewing box, which it's made out of walnut and it's designed to rock forward so that it's easy to access things that are inside. It opens up and it has a little separate folding tray to put the small things. I have several things that belong in my sewing box. In the 18th century, women would have a basket or a box. The first that you might have is you need to keep your needles and your pins. And so a needle book was a very common way. They're made out of wool, and they're just ways to hold your needles so that they were safe and they could be put in a box. Other ways you might keep your needles or your pins, maybe a little pin cushion. This one is designed and made out of a horn, and it has kind of scrimshaw on it. And you might have, there are two different types of little horn pin cushions that might go into your box. If you didn't have a little horn pin cushion or a needle book, you might save little pins in a small little container that's metal. The reason why these pins were kept so secure were that they were very valuable in the fact that during the Revolution, you couldn't get them easily. They were an import. Pins were made one at a time by hand, and they were integral to putting our clothing together, sewing, so many things. And as anybody that works with pins knows, they bend, they break, they get lost. So as soon as the boycott started and you couldn't get pins commonly, you guarded them. So we have our pins. I'm going to look what else is in my little box. We have our thread, because what is a needle without thread? And so you would have little bone or wooden thread winders. And on these thread winders, you would have various colors of thread. It might be linen thread, silk, sometimes wool thread for wool things. They generally didn't specify linen thread. That was just thread. That was the most common kind. Cotton thread wasn't a thing so much then. Silk thread was. So we'll put our thread back in our thread winders in our sewing box. So they came in various different sizes. This is just basic linen thread. Now, because the most common thread to use was linen, and linen has a flaw in it, and the more you pull it in and out of your cloth, the more you're going to pull those little like scales, and it becomes weak. If you use beeswax or wax on the thread, and so you'll run your thread up against the wax and then your finger to smooth it, your wax helps that thread to go in smoothly and preserve it, and then it doesn't become weak. So wax would have been in every colonial woman's sewing kit. Other things that you might have, of course, a tape measure. If you're going to sew, you need your tape measure. They were most often made out of linen tape with numbers written, and so you need to know how many inches. And then I'm going to keep just regular linen tape that's extra. You use tape in so many things when you're sewing, in your petticoats and mending things. So I'll have a little bit of tape in my sewing box, and then maybe just a little bit of linen to patch a shirt or breeches or fix a hole in a pocket. So I might keep just a little fabric, a little tape in with my needles and thread. If I'm going to mark something, I'll have a little bit of chalk so I know where I'm going. So that's very important. Now for other little fun sewing things. Oh, of course, scissors. What is a sewing kit without a good pair of sharp scissors? Things that might be unique to the colonial woman's sewing kit. You may need a little button hook. This is a little button hook, and then it has a little bone handle. Other things. You might need awls. Okay, various forms of Awls, these are all also made of bone. And these ones with the really sharp points, these two, are also known as stilettos. You don't want to break the fibers of your linen or wool or silk. That makes a weakness in it. So if you take your awl, your little point stiletto, and it just moves them for your eyelet just enough that you can sew it. And on the end of some of them have a little blunt edge, and that really is helpful when you're trying to push in a difficult needle or a pin. So you're going to have a variety of awls or stilettos. The next thing we're going to have is maybe a variety of bodkins. Now what bodkins are something that you would be able to, I have a threaded bodkin here, and so if I'm going to want to lace those eyelets with something or run tape through something, I would have various sizes of bodkins. This is a German silver bodkin. These are made of bone, the white ones, and different sizes. You might use a dull bodkin. This is a dull point bodkin, and these are very nice to help if you're sewing things that have a point, get the point turned in. This is made of bone also, and it is just a little creaser. So on linen, I'm not going to get out my iron until I have to. It's laborious. So I will take this and run this across a corner or a seam that I want creased before I sew it, and that's a little bone creaser. Next we have a typical little tweezers, because you never know when you need to pull out a thread. So these are just little whatnots that you might use. Let's say you make a mistake in your sewing and you need a seam ripper. And this is a little wrought iron seam ripper, where on one side you can pick out the seam, the other side it's sharp like a razor blade, and it cuts through the threads to pull out any wrong steps that you've sewn. The seam ripper is my best friend in my sewing kit. We have also needle cases, because like we've talked about, our needles and our pins are very, very valuable. So I might separate my needles and have a specific little needle case. In this area I have two of them, a larger one and a smaller one. And I know my sharps are in here, my embroidery needles are in there, so I'm not going to get them mixed up and I'm not going to lose them. Thimbles. Thimbles are very, very important. You might have them carved out of horn, made out of brass or gold or silver, but you need those thimbles. If you have very fine silk threads, you might have a little thread barrel. And this is just a little barrel that holds some very fine thread, and then it will come out through the hole. I'm not going to rethread it in. And so threads that you don't want to get dirty might be in a thread barrel. Here's another little carved bone thread barrel. And this one, I like to keep this one in my pocket. And this is like a little carved horn made out of antler horn, little sewing kit. It has some silk thread and some linen thread and a little mini needle container. So this one might be in my sewing kit or in my pocket if I'm going for the day, because I might need to mend something, and this is just a spare cartridge. So you have to be prepared, because there were no safety pins, and your other pins are busy holding your clothes together. You might have, this is just simply a little wooden awl, if you couldn't afford a nice bone one, or they would make them in silver. Maybe just a simple plain wooden awl would work. Now, depending on what types of things you wanted to do, if you're going to sew a lot of buttons or garments, you know, you're doing things that aren't just with pins, you might have a little button box with various buttons. Buttons were, generally speaking, more commonly used on men's clothing, and so we have simple buttons that might go on a jacket, or buttons on jackets, or buttons that might hold up suspenders, or mother of pearl buttons for shirts. Here are buttons that this is out of horn and out of wood, and they're meant to cover with cloth to make into other types of buttons. There's all kinds of little button and button toy things that you might use. And again, buttons are valuable, so they would be kept in their own little tin. And we talked about, when making eyelets, not wanting to break the threads. We have to break threads for buttonholes. However, we're going to do it in a very precise manner, and that's why you have a button chisel. And so instead of risking it with those little scissors, you'll have a button chisel that would have the diameter of what type of buttonhole you would want. And that button chisel, you just put it in, you chalk your mark, and then you pound that down with a hammer or whatnot, and you cut a very precise line in your garment that would make your buttonhole. So that's a common thing that would be in your sewing kit. And you could have either one chisel and try to make it cut, or you might have several sizes of chisels. Now, sometimes in sewing we do other fun things. For example, if you're a lace maker, I'm a lace maker and I make bobbin lace. I might keep spare bobbins. These are bobbins carved out of wood, and they're English bobbins. It's frequently, this type of bobbin is carved out of bone, and it has little spangles on it to weight it. It's a very small bobbin, so they would make little glass beads and put them on a bobbin for spangles in colonial times. Many, many different kinds of bobbins, depending on the region that you're getting them from or where you're making your lace. But if you were a lace maker, you might have a bobbin or two spare in your sewing basket. Maybe you were making knotting, and so you might have a couple of knotting shuttles. Knotting was a way to decorate your clothing, your little bags, do it all the time. And so I might have a few bone knotting shuttles in my sewing basket. Or maybe I was into tambour embroidery. So you might have those things. Oh, here's another bobbin. You might have some tambour embroidery hooks. I have the separate hooks, and this is like a little needle case, only it's larger, and it carries my tambour embroidery hooks, because you have different size hooks you put in your holders. And that might be in your sewing case if you like tambour embroidery. Last, we have, of course, a little pinball. And this is when you're on the go sewing. So this you might attach to your belt, your apron string, put it in your pocket, and you might have scissors hanging also. You would want to kind of make sure that those scissors are in a leather holder or something, because many women have cut their petticoat or sat on their scissors. So it's always good if they're contained. Other things that you might do in lieu of a sewing box if you're on the road or just want to keep something in your pocket. This is a housewife, and a housewife is just a little portable sewing kit. So here we have, it's just all rolled up. This is stuffed so it suits as a pincushion and a needle holder very, very well. In it, you would also contain your thimble, and you would have some thread on a thread winder. They're done quite tightly, so you have a little thread and a little thimble. Now, where you have thread, you have wax. So you might have a small wax, maybe some linen to patch, and then some small scissors. And then I have a measuring tape in there and some other things. But this is known as a housewife.